Welcome to the S.O.A.P Bible Study video series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. We have been working our way through the book of Acts for 10 weeks or 10 sessions now. We've come to number 11 and we're down to the end of...
We have worked our way through the book of Acts.
Worked our way through.
Nice. So I want to remind everybody a couple of things that we talked about in the first time we met.
That was a long time ago.
I know, and I really have no idea if these are actually... No, they were. I'm pretty sure they were.
You look back in your notes?
I'm pretty sure. But what we talked about was, hey, as we're going through Acts, keep these things in mind. Mm-hmm. And, so now let's bring them up again and see
if we actually did that.
Yeah. One of the things we said that we were going to see is the church wrestling with issues and trying to figure out who they were and what they were.
Yeah.
And I think we saw that a number of times.
Yeah.
Certainly there was a big question on what do we do with circumcision. That was a huge one in there.
Yep, Jews and Gentiles and that whole mess.
Well, and that brings up the second one was okay, now we have Jews and Gentiles. What's going on? Who are we?
Yeah.
Right? Are we Christians? Okay. Is that a sect of Judaism?
Yep.
Is it something completely new, completely different? Sometimes, they wanted to be together and it kept forcing themselves apart.
Well, and how they saw themselves as opposed to how the outsiders saw them, which
That's
is something
really
we
good
still
point.
deal with today, right?
Yeah.
Denominations and other things. We know who we are. We think we know who we are. But that may not be what other people think looking at looking from the outside.
Yeah, and then the third thing I remember, and I do remember you saying this, that is, as we go through here, remember, these are people.
Yeah.
And we see a little bit of their lives and a little bit of their stories in here, and we see the mess, and it's a cool thing.
Yes, and we get just a snapshot, right? We don't see every little detail. And so that leads us to remember, or try to remember, that just because they did it doesn't mean they were right to do it, right? This is a transition book leading out of the Old Testament into the church.
That's a good way to put it.
And so the way we do it in seminary classrooms and stuff is we say, remember that this is often descriptive but not prescriptive. It's telling, Luke is giving us an accurate recording. This is what we did. I'm not saying you should, but this is what we did.
Yep, that's a good one. And there's not necessarily a lot of doctrine in here.
Yeah.
But it's people's lives and what and what they did.
And there is some, and we'll see this one, Paul's going to keep coming back to the gospel. So there's the doctrine of the gospel. He's still talking about the kingdom of God with the Jewish people. And so there's still some of that. But you're right. It's not as doctrinally heavy
as a letter that he's writing to somebody.
Other places we've been. Yeah.
All right. So last week we remember Paul finally made it to Jerusalem.
Yay.
And he gets there and we learn that Paul has a sister and Paul has a nephew. And unfortunately they tell him people are trying to assassinate you.
Yeah.
So Paul's trying to figure out what's going on with there. He actually... the Romans move him to a different city so they can protect him better.
Yep.
And he has a hearing there. And there's a number of people brought in and out, and it's really Felix was a ruler there, and Paul's talking to him, and it turns out he was looking for a bribe.
Yeah.
And he didn't seem to get one, and the end result was Paul really got put on ice for a couple of years. Right?
Yeah.
He was under house arrest. He could do things. There were certain restrictions that could happen to him, but he was kind of out of commission from taking the gospel to all the nations for 2 years. Another guy takes over. And he immediately wants to take Paul back to Jerusalem. Hey, why not? That's where the people are. Let's go have your trial.
Trial there.
And so Paul appeals.
Yeah.
And that's how he's going to get sent to Rome.
Because as a Roman citizen, he had the right. Every Roman citizen had the option of having their case heard by Caesar himself. And Paul knew, if I go back to Jerusalem, I'm not getting out of this one.
Yeah.
Literally dead. So he's like, if you're not going to hear my case, then I don't have any other recourse. I have to go to Rome. I have to let Caesar hear this because there is no case. Right. There is no legitimate case here.
Right.
And if you're not going to listen to it, then here's what I have to do.
Right. So shortly after that, Paul talks to one more person. He talks to King Agrippa, who is Jewish, and interestingly enough, he presents the gospel message to him.
Yeah.
Which we see him doing, which is cool. So the anticipated steps from last week to this week are Paul's going to Rome.
Yeah.
Right. And so we have, I think, 2 chapters.
Yeah, just the
Paul
last
going
two,
to Rome.
27,
Yeah.
28. It's chapter
And how hard is it,
27
right?
starts with when we decided to sail to Italy. We started the journey, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a whole bunch here. A lot of boat trips, a lot of things happening. But I think the key of this whole thing is don't travel with Paul. That's what I get out of this section.
I would agree with that, because I do travel internationally and domestically.
He's having a lot of problems.
This is not your travel companion of choice.
Man, and we need to remember, Paul knows, he's told, you have delivered the gospel message into Jerusalem. You're going to do the same thing in Rome.
Yeah.
So he knows he's going to make it.
Yeah, Paul knows he's going to get there. But man, if all you're doing is looking at the circumstances,
wow.
these people literally assume they're going to die. And Paul's like, don't worry about it. It's like, the plane's going down, the boat's going. No, don't worry about it. God told me. And they're like, I don't know that I should. You're a prisoner, number one.
Right.
I don't know that I trust you, and I certainly don't know that I trust your God, or because you saw an angel or whatever.
Yeah, well, there's even a point in here where, all the prisoners are going to be killed.
Yeah.
Because they're going to escape, so let's kill them all.
We cannot let the prisoners escape.
That's pretty drastic.
Yeah, because they might, because we're headed for shipwreck, they might swim to shore, or they might swim and get away, and we can't let prisoners get away. This whole thing, if you just read through 27, 28, you've got, it'd be funny if it weren't so sad, right?
Shipwrecks, bit by poisonous snakes, people thinking, oh, you are definitely...
Oh, that one is so good.
Yeah, sinful. Okay.
It's good. Paul is, and we're jumping around, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Paul is. They finally do end up shipwrecked on an island, Malta. By the way, Malta, it still exists. Right there, Maltese Falcon, right? Malta, and so they're wet, they're drenched, it's raining. The people welcome them. They build a fire. Paul is going to be helpful, grab some stuff, wood. Put some food, the wood on the fire, and a viper comes out because of the heat and goes on Paul's arm. And understand the culture, right? These people are looking around, they're like,
you deserve that.
Yeah, obviously, I don't know what kind of prisoner you were, but must have been a murderer, and karma caught up with you, justice caught up with you.
And you're going to die.
Yep, and you deserve it, and nobody cares.
Yeah, right.
And neither does Paul. He shakes off the snake into the fire, and it goes about his business. And everybody's just like, waiting for him to fall over. How
long does it take the poison to get there?
Did you see what kind of snake that? I thought it was. How. And Luke. Let's not forget. Luke is a medical doctor, so his description of this is great. They were expecting him to blow up and then swell up. And they're watching, and I love it because they switch from, oh man, he's a murderer, he's got to die, to
karma, to he must be a god. Right. We should idolize him. We should do all this.
And the thing is that you can see it, right? You can see a pagan culture.
Right. Well, somebody gets bit by that snake, they're dead.
Exactly.
Well, he's not dead. He must not be human.
Right. This isn't the first time. This isn't the first time that Paul was considered a god.
Yeah.
Because
was it Timothy he was with?
Barnabas. Because Barnabas was Zeus, and Paul was the
second guy.
And now he's a guy. Didn't say which god. Didn't really matter, but he can't be hurt. Now here's what's interesting.
Yeah, Hermes, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Right. Back in Mark chapter 16, there's this verse that charismatics really, really like. And that is, when people believe, there will be signs that follow them. Okay, and Jesus, it doesn't say that everybody's going to do miracles, that people take this, really out of proportion, but it says that those who believe, signs will follow them. And one of them is they'll be bitten by snakes and not be hurt. Now, you go into the deep south, you go into Appalachia, you go into certain places in this country, and they make a thing of this. They have pits of vipers and snake handlers and all this stuff, and they can't figure out why they get bit and die because the verse says they won't.
Well, they didn't have enough faith. Right. Or they must not have been a Christian.
So here we have an example of somebody. Now, Paul wasn't, snake handling. He wasn't trying to do all this stuff. But Jesus said, it's going to happen. And it happened. Should we be, this is one of those descriptive, not prescriptive thing. Should we get into snake handling?
Does that
because
mean
there's one verse that said,
right?
No, Jesus said it was going to happen. Here, it happened. Should we expect it to happen all the time? No, he never said that, right? Yeah. But he miraculously, so this wasn't even an example of Paul doing a miracle. This is an example of God protecting Paul. He wasn't expecting it to happen. He didn't try to make it happen, right? But God used it in a scenario so that then Paul could preach the gospel. Right. He was able to heal some people, and they ended up staying there for several months through the winter.
Right. I found that to be humorous, right? Because when you and I go on a trip, sometimes we have to spend the night.
Yeah.
Someplace. And Paul said, well, we're going to have to spend the winter
here. Yeah.
It's like, wow. But that is one of the things to pick up out of this story. So there's a bunch of nautical things in here. They're talking about the wind and the leeward side of the island, and you got to remember that these boats are powered by wind.
Yeah.
Or somebody oaring, oaring.
Yep.
And they talk about the ship's boat on there, which I take as the little thing when you park the boat out and drop your anchor, it gets you from there to shore
type thing. Yep.
Yeah, back and forth, and so that comes up. But also realize what the time of year is. I mean, they're in very late fall, getting into winter, and they have a long voyage ahead of them.
Yeah,
and
these are experienced sailors.
Yeah, and Paul's like, guys, we're not going to make it. Yeah. We need to hold up for the winter. And Luke puts a line in there that says, the centurion was more convinced by the captain, which I absolutely love. But you can see Paul saying, all right, guys, we're staying here for the winter, blah, blah, blah. You go do this, you go do that. And everybody's like, isn't he a prisoner? Yeah, right. Why are we listening to this guy? Right. And the centurion's like, I think we should listen to the captain.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, Yeah. But it's true. I mean, the captain's supposed to know. He's got a crew. Yeah. They've sailed this way, how many times, right? I love the fact that, around, especially in the eastern United States on the seaboard and everything, right? You have a particular type of wind and storm called a nor'easter. Right? It's a northeasterly wind, and we just call it a nor'easter. And it's a particular type. They actually ran into a nor'easter.
I actually looked that up and said, wow, what word is that? Yeah, so my sister lives in Boston, and it's these storms that just come up and hit with a flurry, and then you're fine the next day, kind of deal.
So it took them, and you have to understand the geography a little bit. It shouldn't have taken them probably even a month total to get from Israel,
right,
to
Caesarea,
Rome.
Right?
Yes,
Caesarea, which is right there.
Yeah, and they went north and they landed at Tyre because it's a major port city, and then they were going to cut across the Mediterranean. You can look at the map, and it should.
Yeah, well, and I think people should too, right? You can easily, Paul's trip to Rome, and it will bring up the route he took.
Well, it took them more than 2 weeks in this storm just to make it over to Cyprus and then to Crete. Right. I mean, literally, they were fighting against the wind. They were zigzagging. They were trying to do all this stuff. And these are experienced sailors that this is their livelihood. And they could not get across the sea.
Right. Now, I also, when I have that pictured, I have, 5 prisoners, 10... sailors.
Yeah.
Not a huge ship, not a small ship, somewhere in there.
Right.
There was 276 men aboard.
Yeah.
right? That's huge.
Well, there was a centurion, and a centurion leads 100 soldiers.
So, but would those 100 soldiers have been on there?
Yeah, because remember, Paul's life is in danger.
Right.
And last time we saw, there was 2 centurions because they had, hundreds of soldiers, and they had spears, and they had all of these people they were protecting him. So they've got to. This is a political prisoner now. He's going to Caesar. You can't take any chances with this guy.
Yeah.
So there were some prisoners. We don't know how many prisoners, but there were at least 100 soldiers on this ship.
Well, so you also have these sailors, and you have the centurion with 100 people behind him.
Yeah.
That's carrying a lot of weight. I think we should hold up for the winner. Okay, we're staying in for the winner, versus let's vote on it type of thing.
Yep.
Yeah, nice point.
So they were shipwrecked, and this is just one, by the way. In 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about multiple shipwrecks, multiple beatings, multiple things that we don't get all of those in Acts. We have to. This is, it's not like his favorite holiday type thing,
right?
But this happened to Paul on a regular basis.
I think we talked about it going through how discouraged you'd have to be.
Yeah.
Right? But then you talk to God, and you get all fired up again.
Yeah.
And you understand what's going on.
All right, so they finally make it through the winter, and it was Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. So on our modern calendar, we're thinking mid-October-ish. Okay, so just think about what winter is like here in our area anyway, mid-October-ish, going into winter. So they park for 3 months. They finally, their ship is gone. So now they have to wait for a new ship to show up. They all transfer onto that, and then they can go off to Rome. Finally gets to Rome, and we finish up chapter 28 then in Rome.
Yeah, so he is finally in front of the Jewish leaders, and as he was told he was going to do, he is taking the gospel message to Rome.
Yep.
I would take that to be Rome Caesar, but it's really the Jewish leaders in Rome that he's talking to.
Well, because he never actually sees Caesar on this trip. He never gets to present his case.
Does he? Oh, there's no need to it.
Because until the accusers get there to make the case, he can't defend.
Right. So there's no reason to be in front, and
They
never show up.
They never show up. The people from Jerusalem never show up to make their case. So he's there for 2 years because that's the statute of limitations.
Right. So he was iced for 2 years in Caesarea.
Yep.
And now he's iced again in Rome. So he's really taken out of pocket for 4 years. I think we've talked before that that's really all the Jewish leaders cared about. Right. Let's just get him off the street.
Yeah. But Luke tells us that he lived there for this is the last 2 verses of the book. He lived there for 2 whole years in his own rented quarters, because that was the thing. He had to pay for this. So people were supporting him, churches were supporting him, whatever, Philippi and whatever, and welcomed all who came to him, proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with complete boldness and without restriction. So he was under guard, he was under house arrest, but his accusers never showed up. So even though he couldn't travel, he had a team. Letters were coming in and out. He wrote, it was during this time that he wrote Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon, what we call the prison epistles. Right. It was during this time. So he used his time well. He preached, he wrote, he still was engaged in ministry. He just didn't get to travel. So, he didn't waste his time.
Right. Right. Well, he also spoke in front of the Jewish leaders, and I think it's important to talk about that a little bit. So, I can just throw it over the fence, right? What happened there? But he gained an audience with them, and they were, we've heard about you, we've heard about this, we'd like to learn more. Yeah. Which is better than he got in a lot of places. Yeah. So Paul was able to deliver a gospel message, was able to spend a considerable amount of time with them, and when he gets done, what happens? They all accept his message?
Of course not. Some believe so. I like the fact that they specifically said, we haven't even received, we didn't know there were any accusations against you. We haven't heard anything about that. So they were sort of unpoisoned well, right? They were sort of a
Right.
blank slate where he got to present from scratch.
Yeah.
So that was very cool.
Yeah, so some believed, a lot didn't. Paul goes off at him at the end.
Yeah.
It's just as we were told.
Yep.
You guys are not listening. You continue not to listen.
Yep.
You continue to hear but not listen.
It's interesting because he quotes from Isaiah the same thing that Jesus did when he switched to speaking in parables. You're hearing this, but you're not actually hearing. You're seeing it, but you're not actually seeing. And Paul, in his case, he's like, that's why he sent me to the Gentiles.
So this seemed to be a big deal from God's point of view. You're going to Rome to proclaim this gospel message. So Jesus, at the time of Jesus, he was definitely rejected.
Yep.
Now we have this, Jesus brought in a new thing, but now we have a new thing, Christianity, and this is rejected.
Yeah.
Also.
Yeah.
Is there significance there?
Well, it's the same thing where what Paul wrote a few years earlier in Romans was that Israel as a nation is under a partial hardening. Whereas a nation, they can't turn back to God or turn to God through Jesus, but individual Jews can. So he's not expecting a national revival. Well, maybe he was, because he didn't have have the rest of the New Testament. He didn't have all the revelation we have. So he wasn't really expecting a national revival, but he was really hoping that, given his testimony, given his background, his experience, the fact that he had seen Jesus, that was part of his story. Every time he got to share his testimony, Jesus himself told, and it just wasn't enough. They just were not accepting it.
Right.
So, yeah, he's standing before kings and princes and Caesar. All this stuff is what Jesus told him he would do. But what John says in John 1, the Gospel of John, about Jesus, he came to his own people and his own people rejected him. And that's true while he was alive, during his ministry, after his death and resurrection. Israel continues to reject him as Messiah, and we still see the same today.
Okay. So Acts kind of ends a little abruptly.
Yeah.
What happens to Paul? Do we know?
Well,
biblical-wise, we don't know.
We don't know, but he was released. After these 2 years, he was released. In Romans, he said he wanted to get over to Spain. That's sort of the end of the known world: France, Gaul, right, and Spain. We don't know if he did. We think that he probably did. There's some church history that says that he may have. But within 2 years, he was, a couple of years, 2 or 3 years maybe, he was rearrested, brought back to Rome. And it was from there that he wrote 2 Timothy, and he was beheaded. So
we don't know in 2 Timothy that he was beheaded, but he wrote 2 Timothy.
And he said, my time is short. I'm about ready to die.
Right.
And then church history tells us that he was beheaded in Rome. Yeah.
Okay.
Right around the year 66, Nero was emperor. It was sort of at the height of Nero's persecution of Christianity and Judaism by that point. The worst part was from 66 to 68. It was really ramping up there, and it started in Rome. And Nero was killed in 68. But Peter and Paul both were killed right around 66.
Okay. And remember, Acts, we've been in it so long. The first half was really about the disciples, right? And then we got into Paul and his journey right about in the middle.
Yeah,
actually.
yeah. And when we introduced this, we said that Luke, when he wrote the Gospel of Luke as part 1 and Acts as part 2. And the way that it's ended so abruptly, some people think there was supposed to be a part 3. Yeah, the continuing journey of Paul or whatever, and we just don't have that. Right. So I think we've been through COVID and we never know what's coming next, and some people get discouraged. If I'm sheltering in place, if I'm quarantined, if I'm locked down, if I'm sick and I can't go anywhere, if I'm disabled and I can't do anything, can I really have a ministry? I'm looking
It's
at
a
Paul.
good- yeah.
For multiple years, he is intentionally put aside and he can't do anything, and yet he does a lot. And I think that's a good
good
encouragement for us that we can't let our situation knock us out.
Right. There's other avenues that you
Yeah.
can pursue.
Yeah, even if we're bedridden, we can pray. Maybe we can talk on the phone or write a note or whatever. But yeah, Paul didn't let quarantine knock him out. So
Yeah.
I think that's
so we shouldn't either.
So we shouldn't either. So that brings us to
place
the
to
end.
end.
Yeah, that brings us to the end of the book of Acts. Hope that you have enjoyed this time that we've spent together. If you have any questions, make sure you ask. Make sure that you share this with your friends and family. And we will come back next time with a brand new book, and we'll just keep working our way through the Bible. So see you next time.
Bye, everyone.